Has the US-Israeli war on Iran made the world safer? The fighting has stopped for now, but major questions remain over Iran's nuclear program, the Strait of Hormuz, and whether the Pakistan brokered framework agreement can deliver a lasting peace. And as NATO leaders gather in Ankara, what does the war mean for the alliance's future? I'm Neil Harvey, and this is the Newsmakers. Iran is saying goodbye to the man who led the country for almost 4 decades. Funeral ceremonies for Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei are a stark reminder of how much the US-Israeli war has changed the region. But while Tehran mourns, attention's turning to Ankara. NATO leaders are meeting against the backdrop of a war that tested alliances, exposed divisions, and renewed questions about America's commitment to its allies. As Europe increases defence spending and President Trump continues to challenge the alliance's direction, could this war reshape NATO as much as it has the Middle East? Here's a look at where things stand.
Iranians gather in Tehran for the funeral of their former leader, who was killed on the opening day of the US-Israeli war against Iran. Meanwhile, thousands of kilometres away in Turkey's capital Ankara, the crucial NATO summit begins. It comes at a time when transatlantic unity is under strain due to the conflict with Iran. NATO hasn't been directly involved in military operations regarding Iran, but the conflict has exposed diverging goals between Europe and Washington over the organisation's obligations. President Donald Trump's transactional approach to NATO is long-standing, harking back even to the campaign trail before his first term.
When I talk about NATO, we're talking about tremendous amounts of money that we put in. Now we're defending countries, and we're not getting reimbursed anywhere near the cost of doing it.
More than 10 years later, at least partially, the US president got his wish. Many European countries have increased their military spending.
NATO must become more European so that it can remain transatlantic. I think that is a very apt way of putting it. In recent years, we have done too little for our own security. We are now making up for that.
Ahead of the conference, a renewed statement on NATO's collective defence commitment under Article 5 is anticipated. Additionally, reiterations that Iran must never obtain a nuclear weapon, and a commitment to freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. But Trump has made no secret of his displeasure at what he views as a lack of help from European allies throughout the Iran war. Notably, Italy prohibited the US military from using its air bases in Sicily for air raids during the Iran war. Spain closed its airspace to US military aircraft used in the response to Iran. France rejected US insistence to help unblock the Strait of Hormuz. NATO allies interpret Article 5 as applying only if a member is attacked, rather than as a blanket requirement to join a war if the US instigates the attack, especially as European nations were not consulted before the war started and felt blindsided by the strikes. In a recent trip to Washington, the NATO Secretary General called for stronger transatlantic unity.
But we need, as US and Europe, to stay together, because this is also about the defense of the United States, preventing these nuclear submarines from Russia ending up at the shores here, Europe being a platform of power protection for the United States.
European leaders are concerned that if they involve themselves in the Iran war, it'll set themselves up for Iranian attacks, and detract from their support for Ukraine in the ongoing war with Russia. NATO allies have historically refused US calls for intervention in wars and conflicts. The UK refused to join the Vietnam War. France stayed out of the Iraq War. But Donald Trump's transactional nature makes him very different from previous US presidents. And NATO has learned to take his words seriously, so concerns about a possible future without the inclusion of the US aren't dismissed out of hand.
Well, to discuss the latest developments in the Iranian peace process and much more, let's bring in our panel. Joining me now from Tehran, research fellow at the University of Tehran, that's Mohammed Eslami. From Nantucket Island, Massachusetts, UK Chair of Republicans Overseas, Greg Swenson. And also from Washington, Director of the Iran Programme at the Middle East Institute, Alex Vatanka. Welcome to you all, gentlemen. Mohammed, I'd like to start with you because as we see the funeral proceedings that are taking place currently in Iran, it's a reminder of where this all began. The US trying to destabilize Iran, killing the supreme leader, dropping thousands of bombs, urging the people of Iran to rise up and overthrow the leaders. It didn't happen, but how has all of that, the death and destruction, affected Iran's stability? Has it made it much less stable, or has it ironically actually perhaps unified the country against an outside threat?
First of all, thank you so much for having me and happy to talk with you again. What happened during the last war is very astonishing because while it was a war of choice by Donald Trump and Bibi Netanyahu and the Iranians and the Iranian land, they started a war, a bloody war based on miscalculations about the Iranian society, Iranian army, and Iranian economy. And after that, when they started the war, it was obvious and it was clear that they didn't have any kind of strategy regarding this war. So while the Iranians were thinking and were focused on this strategy toward the war, the Americans didn't have any plan because they have started the war only by misled information and not true information by Bibi Netanyahu. So what happened during the war is astonishing because for the first time, we witnessed that the Iranian leadership started to manage a kind of negotiation and a kind of, preemptive attacks on the Israelis at the same time. So I think that, yes, Donald Trump was successful in a kind of regime change, but not a regime change he wanted before the war. The new leadership in Iran are thinking about changing their policy from a kind of resistance to a kind of dominance. They are thinking about the Strait of Hormuz and also the Strait of Bab el-Mandab. They are thinking about these kind of, very important points regarding the maritime. They are thinking about the global economy. They thought that the global economy was bleeding during the war. They saw that the NATO member states declined Trump's request to join the war. And right now we are witnessing a new Islamic Republic after the late Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei.
Alex, let's bring you in now. Mohammed was saying that, to some extent, in terms of regime change, the US had some success. But Donald Trump said, really, this was about removing a threat, making the world safer, removing the possibility of Iran having a nuclear weapon. In terms of Iran's nuclear program, we don't really seem to know exactly what's going on at this point. We have learned, though, that Iran has the capability to hurt Gulf states, allies of the United States. It's also, we've discovered it has the ability to hurt the economic markets that affect everybody globally. So, in terms of what we know after 4 months of conflict, has actually this war made the world safer, as Donald Trump said it would, or has it made it more unsafe?
I don't think it has made the world safe. It's made it more complicated, and it's made life a heck of a lot harder for a lot of Iran's neighbors. And Donald Trump did not factor that into his calculations because, frankly, the American president went into this war, which he could have made, he could have justified going to this war if he had actually taken the time intellectually, materially to prepare. Throughout this conflict, what Donald Trump wanted to do was to achieve a quick victory, kind of similar to what he achieved in Venezuela. And he didn't listen to the experts. The United States has plenty of experts whose lives, entire careers have been on sitting and thinking about hard questions like countries like Iran, what do you do? And they would have all unanimously said to him, don't do it. He didn't listen to them. And here we are. So he never had a strategy to begin with. But the fact that he's sort of trying to end this before it gets worse is good. And I think, Donald Trump should be commended for the fact that he's seen his mistake. He's trying to wrap it up and get the United States out of something that could be potentially very consequential for this country, particularly if you keep in mind that Iran is not the main challenge for the United States going forward. We all know it is China, it's to some extent Russia, but it's certainly not Iran. Iran is a regional actor that's been a pain in the neck for the United States going back to 1979. But to Mohammed's point about, some of the voices that I agree with him are talking about Iran rising, Iran dominating. This is a case of Iranian overconfidence. And whether we, agree or disagree with in terms of what the United States did, whether this war was legal, illegal, all the rest of it, we can discuss that. The point is, there's a window of opportunity here. And Ali Khamenei, after 37 years, is gone. There's a new generation of Iranian leaders. Donald Trump seems to be open. He's not talking about regime change. If the Islamic Republic wants to move on, survive as a regime, as a country, I would be much more focused in terms of trying to build bridges with this Trump administration than trying to sort of litigate the past or engage in essentially dreaming about dominating the Middle East. I don't think it's going to happen. Yes, Iran has proven to be much more entrenched, much more of a military capable adversary than a lot of people had assumed would be the case. And the geography of the Strait of Hormuz certainly helped Iran. But Iran doesn't have an economy. And more importantly, it doesn't have the majority of its own people behind this regime. I would say vast majority of Iranians want to go in a very different direction. And some Iranian leaders are openly admitting to what Iranians want. It's a focus on economic development. If that's what you want to de-escalate, you want to end this war. Yes, you don't like Donald Trump. That's understandable. But at the end of the day, he's going to be in the White House for some 2 years. So maybe it's better, more creative, more helpful for Iranian leaders once the funeral of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is over, to think about how to build bridges and avoid another round of conflict, which is not in Iran's interest and not in the interest of the United States or the broader Middle East.
Let's bring Greg Swenson now. Greg, Alex was suggesting there that Donald Trump thought it might be as easy as what happened in Venezuela, that this could be a fairly short-term conflict to achieve success. Instead, it hasn't turned out that way. And I wonder if this has had actually an impact on NATO, because it was such a struggle for the US at one point that we saw President Trump calling on European members of the bloc to help out, to send warships to the Strait of Hormuz to help reopen it. And several of them simply refused to do that. I mean, the consequence of that was President Trump threatened to withdraw from NATO altogether. Do you think, there were already cracks clearly in NATO, but do you think this war has had the impact of widening those cracks certainly between the US and European allies?
Well, I think you bring up a good point. Initially, the NATO allies were kind of keeping their distance from this whole situation in Iran. I think many of them have come around, and I think that maybe once they saw that the U.S. had the upper hand in terms of the military and the armed conflict, they sort of bet on the winner and said, okay, yeah, maybe we'll come in and help clear the strait, or we'll send our demining vessels to the strait. It's one of those things where I think the president would like to have support, but we don't necessarily need the support. And so it's not a yes or no thing. It's more of a, it would be nice to have. And I think you'll see some of that in the discussions in NATO. Yes, they are definitely related. I think this is an opportunity for the president to criticize the NATO allies that maybe drag their feet initially anyway, and also look at the longer term issue, which is that clearly the Western, especially the Western NATO allies, Western European NATO allies, are not spending enough on their own defense and on the military support that we need. Let's face it, the U.S. wants a stronger NATO, that's for sure. And I think
do you think there was a bit of payback coming out here as well? Because previously, the rhetoric from Donald Trump, he seemed like he was rubbing some of his allies up the wrong way. The threats of taking control of Greenland, the comments about absorbing Canada. It's not the kind of talk you would expect between friends and allies. Do you think this was a little bit of, well, if you're going to treat us like that, we're not going to be there when you ask for it?
There's a certain element of that, but he's been doing this for over 10 years. This is not new, and I think even President Obama was making it clear that the sort of raised their game, and so the president's been very deliberate about this for quite some time. I think this is just another opportunity in that process, and the president wants a stronger NATO. If anything, he's actually done quite a bit of good for NATO because they're actually thinking about these issues now, and you hear that from the chairman, the NATO chairman, constantly. And so I think, the president's been putting the pressure on the NATO allies, and again, especially the Western European NATO allies, and it's a long time coming. I mean, this is something that the president's been very clear about, and he's right on this. And so his methods are often uncomfortable and make people feel uncomfortable, but that's probably in the long run a good thing.
So just very, very quickly, like 10 seconds, when he says he's threatening to leave the alliance, is that just a bluff to get what he wants? Okay, nod of the head, it's a bluff. Okay, we've seen that before.
Bluff. I don't think there's any possibility of that.
Okay, the famous Donald Trump bluff. Let's come back to Mohammed now. Mohammed, I would say Iran surprised many people, certainly the United States, with the effectiveness of its, what we're calling this hybrid approach to warfare. So combining strikes on US allies, that caught a few people by surprise, influencing the global energy prices with influence on the Strait of Hormuz. Do you think that this has now opened up perhaps a template for other countries to follow? And we're seeing that the effectiveness of these techniques might prove that the strongest military might not actually be the deciding factor.
What we saw during the war was a very important thing. The most powerful military in the history of humankind tried to do a regime change in a country which was under severe sanctions for 2 decades. A couple of months ago, their agent tried to ignite a kind of civil war in this country. So they have tried everything they could. I don't think that Donald Trump is open to discuss with Iranians. I think that he doesn't have any other choice but to talk with the Iranians, because he did what he could during the war. Before the war, in his first term, Trump withdrew from the JCPOA. JCPOA was a kind of international agreement endorsed by UN Security Council. So right now the Iranians cannot and will not trust the Americans, because they have started 2 wars at the time of active negotiations with the Iranians. The thing that Iranians going to trust is the realities on the ground. The realities on the ground is the resilience of the Iranian economy. The realities on the ground is the patriotism within the Iranian society. I agree with Alex that there are lots of criticism regarding the Iranian government behavior in terms of economy. But I'm not agree with him that those people who were today shouting and chanting against Donald Trump will ask government to sacrifice their demands regarding the revenge with some kind of sanctions relief or something like that. The Iranian society is a very, very complex society. Right now, I think after these 2 wars, Iranian policy-making debates are about the question, what was their problem? Because it was more than 2 decades trying to make a kind of resistance axis in the region. But at the end of the day, they understood that this resistance is not working. I agree with Alex that we should be realistic regarding the capabilities of the Iranians and the Iranian army and Iranian foreign policy system. But at the same time, what we are hearing from internal debates in Tehran is, instead of waiting for the adversaries to attack us, we should change our policies toward the region. And it doesn't mean that the Iranians want to make problems for other countries. For example, when we are talking about the new framework for passing through the Strait of Hormuz, the Iranians don't want the Strait of Hormuz to be closed. They want to use the Strait of Hormuz in a way to go out of the regime of sanctions and have a kind of bilateral relations with East Asian countries and also the European countries, and also talk with the neighbors around the Persian Gulf. So I think that we are in a kind of, a very critical moment toward the new foreign policy by the Iranian system.
I want to come back to Alex now, just because you referred earlier to what you saw as overconfidence from Iran. And I just wonder, we saw the leverage in the Strait of Hormuz prove so effective so far in this conflict. Do you think there's a danger they might try to use that again, and that actually going forward, there might be more pushback, perhaps even a global united pushback, because of just how everyone is affected economically if they use that lever?
Yeah, it's really important to remember for the last many years now, what Iran would do in terms of getting everyone's attention around the world when they were out of options and they needed leverage. What did Iran do? They increased more in terms of enrichment of the uranium. So we went all the way up to 60%. Obviously, that's before the United States and Israel struck Iran in the 2025 12-day war and then this latest conflict. So that's what Iran used to do. That's gone for now. We don't really know the state of Iran's nuclear program. It is not entirely done, but it's certainly not in a good place. And Iran doesn't have that option. And then thanks to Donald Trump, the Iranians discovered, and they knew this all along, that they have actually called this Strait of Hormuz, the other leverage. They've known since the 1980s that's a card they can play. But I think the Iranians were surprised how much of a card this actually is. 20% of global oil going out of the Strait of Hormuz, which basically is controlled by Iran, means a lot. And so they are going to protect that leverage to the extent they can. And we've seen that with some pot shots being taken at some of the ships that are sailing out closer to the Omani coast. And I understand what the Iranian calculations are. But here's the thing, and don't take my word for it. Let me quote the chief Iranian nuclear negotiator, Mohammed Eslami, who said, let's not overplay our hands here. You can use the Strait of Hormuz as long as there's actually commercial traffic leaving the Persian Gulf. If the day comes there is no commercial traffic, then the Strait of Hormuz is useless. In other words, there are folks in Tehran who know that if they want to be a normal state, not a mafia state, not a criminal syndicate that takes shipping hostage, if they want billions of dollars of investment in their economy, the way Iran potentially could, then they shouldn't overplay the card when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz. And by the way, I should point out, whether they like the United States to be in the Middle East or not, that's really not up to Iran. Iran could choose not to have the United States in Iran, and they'll pay the consequence for that. I mean, good luck to them just putting all their eggs in the basket of the Chinese or the Russians. Whether you like it or not, the United States is still a military power. It's an economic power. And that's what the Gulf countries, Iran's neighbors, recognize. And that's why they have the United States as a partner. So Iran needs to, one way or another, directly, perhaps not, but certainly indirectly, because of the ties U.S. have with the Gulf countries and countries like Iraq and others, Iran needs to deal with that issue. And faster they get to that point and stop the slogans of the last 47 years of United States leave the Middle East, which might happen at some point, but it won't happen anytime soon. I think faster we might come to a point of where we can start maybe talking about post-war security architecture that actually would benefit everyone, including the Iranians.
Greg, you said a few minutes ago you thought it was a bluff when President Trump threatened to withdraw from NATO, but he also recently called the alliance a paper tiger and said he was going to withdraw 5,000 US troops from Germany. That was after Friedrich Merz, the Chancellor, had said that basically the US had been humiliated in negotiations by Iran. Do you think he was bluffing once again? Because the danger there is that actually European countries might, and do you think they'll do this? Do you think they might go, look, we can't rely on the US, certainly not under President Trump. We need to form some kind of action plan between ourselves, between European nations, in terms of what we do if there's a new military conflict, or perhaps they'll look for other senior members of the alliance as their go-to partner?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think the president, again, is using his sort of unfiltered methods of calling people out and bringing attention to things. And so, look, 5,000 is significant, but it's not really meaningful in the grand scheme of things. There's so many troops that we have, not only in Germany, but in Italy and other countries. So, yeah, I think the president might be frustrated, but I think he's all about outcomes. And I think, you could say the same thing in Iran. We're dealing with a regime that's kind of got this lunatic ideology that they prefer over rationality. And if they move more to rationality, that's a good thing. It's a good thing for the region. It's a good thing for the world. And I think we're sensing that they have to look at their own economy, for example. Yes, they have the strait, but we also have the ability to blockade Iran, and we did that successfully with economic fury. And so, I think you'll see the same thing in Europe. I think that the outcomes of this NATO gathering will be a stronger NATO, and if that means that the Western European countries take responsibility and actually increase defense and security spending and depend less on the U.S., that's a good thing. That's part of our strategy that was outlined late last year
And
know,
Greg,
that
I
we're
just want
focusing
to
on the
quickly
Western
interrupt you because
Hemisphere,
we've
we're
got less than
focusing
1
on-
minute left, and I
on-
want to just
on the
very
Pacific,
quickly,
of course.
just want to very quickly get your answer to
And
this.
may
Just
I
a
say
few seconds
something
left.
regarding?
Sorry,
may say
Mohammed, I just want to go
may I
to
say
Greg. So the US has found perhaps that European bases are actually quite useful in terms of fighting a war in the Middle East. Do you think that now President Trump might take a softer approach towards European countries? Just quickly.
I think so. Look, we still have a massive presence in Western Europe and Eastern Europe for that matter. And so if we move some troops around, we maybe focus on the Baltics and Poland and less on Germany and Italy, which was kind of something that was important 80 years ago, but not necessarily important now. And so we're still going to have a massive presence in Europe, even if we reduce it somewhat.
Gentlemen, it's been an absolute pleasure to get your thoughts on all this. Thank you so much to my guests, Mohammed Eslami, Greg Swenson, and Alex Vatanka. Thank you to you all indeed. And thank you to everybody at home for watching. Remember, you can follow us on social media and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Neil Harvey. See you next time.